Hi, I'm Miss Sarah, and this is At Home Makerspace, where every week I show you how to make fun projects with things you can find at home. This week, I'll be showing you how to make paper beads, like these. These beads are super simple to make, and once you know how to do it, you can make all kinds of different beads. So let's go ahead and get started. Paper beads can be a great way to recycle scraps of paper. To make them, you'll need some sort of paper. It could be white computer paper, colored computer paper, patterned paper, construction paper, a paper bag, magazine, newspaper, or even wrapping paper. Just make sure it's not too thin like tissue paper or too thick like cardboard or cardstock. You'll also need a ruler and pencil, scissors, or a paper cutter, a thin tube to wrap your paper around like a nail, toothpick, paintbrush, chopstick, or knitting needle, and some glue like a glue stick or white glue and a small brush. I do think the white glue works a bit better, so use it if you have it. With those supplies, you can make all sorts of different beads. But to get us started, I thought I'd show you how to make this classic paper bead shape. As you can see, this is a long, thin bead, which is a little thicker in the middle. Here's how you make it. We'll start by tracing a long triangle shape on our paper. We want to stretch our triangle along this long end. So to get started, I'm going to place my ruler along the short edge and mark 2 inches right here. This will be how wide our bead is. Next, I'll go to the other short side and mark 1 inch. If you happen to be making a bead that's a different size, your second mark should be half the length of your first mark. Now I'm going to place my ruler between those 2 lines and draw a nice straight line between them. Then I'm going to go from that top mark to the bottom corner, and this will be the rest of our triangle. And as you can hopefully see here, we now have a long, thin triangle that runs the length of our paper. Next, I'm going to grab a pair of scissors and cut out this triangle. If you want a nice, straight, smooth cut, I do recommend cutting so you're using your whole scissor blade to make the cut rather than lots of short, choppy cuts. This will just make everything smoother when you start to roll your bead. You could also use a paper cutter for a nice clean cut. When you're done cutting your paper, grab a long, thin tube to wrap your paper around. I'm using a knitting needle and I'm placing it over the end and lining the paper up with the knitting needle, rolling it over to get started. And I want to make sure it's nice and tight up against my knitting needle. Then I'm just going to start rolling my paper up around the needle. And don't worry if this takes you a little bit of time to figure out how to do. This is the hardest part of the beads, is just figuring out how to get it rolled up correctly. And as you might be able to see, as I roll it, you can see the layers of the paper edges start to form here. And the trick is just to keep your triangle centered so you're rolling it up and it's the same amount of rolled paper on the left side as you have on the right side. If your bead starts to look lopsided, no worries, just unwrap it a little bit, reposition it and start wrapping again, and just try to keep that triangle in the middle. Next, we're going to grab our glue. And I'm going to use a paintbrush to make sure I get a nice thin layer. And I'm adding glue to the last couple inches of my triangle. Make sure it's a nice thin layer across the whole triangle end. All right, that's looking good. So the last thing I'll do is just roll up this tail, and the glue should hold everything in place. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to roll it between my fingers a few extra times to make sure everything's secure. And there we go. That is our final bead. Now you can let it dry on your needle, but I'm going to go ahead and slip it off just so that you can see what our final bead looks like. Earlier, I showed you all the different kinds of paper you could use to make a paper bead, and I really encourage you guys to experiment with different kinds of paper. Papers will have different thicknesses, different textures, even different patterns, and these can all create some really fun beads. So to give you guys an example, I decided to make another bead using the exact same pattern with some thick construction paper. So I started by making a triangle that was 2 inches at the bottom and was stretched across the long side of my paper. And once you've created your triangle, go ahead and cut it out. Next, grab your thin tube. I'm again using a knitting needle, and I'm wrapping my paper around the tube. Because the paper is a bit thicker, you may find it a little more difficult to wrap the thick paper around your tube. Then add a thin layer of glue to the last couple of inches and finish rolling your paper to hold everything in place. And there is your finished bead. And as you can see, using thicker paper created a thicker bead. Thinner paper would create a thinner bead. But besides playing around with the thickness of your paper, one really fun thing to do is experiment with different patterns of paper. So if you use paper that has some kind of print or pattern on it, it can be really surprising what the pattern looks like when you roll it into a bead. So to give you an example, I decided to use a piece of paper from a magazine. If you're using a paper with a pattern, like this paper, one thing to keep in mind is that the thick end of your triangle will be the colors that appear on the outsides of your bead, and the color on the thin end will be the colors in the middle of your bead. So I'm drawing my triangle, so I will have white on the outsides of my bead and green in the middle. The other thing you'll want to keep in mind is that when you start rolling your bead, you'll actually want to flip your paper over like this before you begin to roll. Now once I start rolling, you can hopefully see that the white will be on the outsides here, and my green will start appearing in the middle of my bead. So keep rolling until you have just a couple of inches left. Then we're adding glue once again in a thin layer to the end of our triangle, and we're going to finish by rolling it up. And there is the finished bead. So if we take a look at our magazine paper, computer paper, and construction paper beads side by side, you can see how much variety you get just by changing the kind of paper. Another fun thing to do is experiment with different sizes and shapes. Now, there are lots of different shapes that you could try, but here are a few popular ones and how to make them. To make our round bead, I'm going to make a long, thin triangle that's very, very narrow. It's only going to be 1/4 inch, which is this long line right here by the word made. So I'm going to line up my ruler with the bottom of my paper and make a little mark right there at the 1/4 inch mark. And if you remember, I mentioned before, I just need to make sure that my top mark is half the width of my bottom mark, so I'm going to mark it at 1/8 of an inch. So here is my 1/4 inch, and half of that is my 1/8 of an inch. And now I'm just going to draw a couple of lines to make my triangle and cut that out when I'm finished. Now all that's left is wrapping it around my knitting needle and gluing the end in place. And that is what my round bead will look like. To draw your cylinder, it's very, very simple. Grab your ruler and mark how wide you'd like your bead to be. I want mine to be 1 inch, so I'm making a mark here at 1 inch, going to the other side of my paper, and I'm also marking the same amount, so 1 inch. Then simply place your ruler between those two marks and draw your straight line. You're basically making a long rectangle. Cut it out when you're done. Then you'll simply roll your paper around your long, thin tube. And when you're done, your cylinder bead will look like this. So far, our triangle shapes have been like the red triangle, called an isosceles triangle. For our cone, we'll need to make the yellow triangle shape. It's called a right triangle. So start by making a mark on the bottom of your paper. I'm making mine at 1 inch because I want my bead to be 1 inch wide. And then I'm simply going to take my ruler, going from that mark to the corner on the other side of the paper. So this time I'm drawing a right triangle. Then cut it out. Now we'll wrap it up like we've been doing with our other beads. But one thing to note about this cone shape is there's a straight side here and an angled side here. As you're rolling, you want to make sure that the edges of the straight side line up like the edges of the cylinder bead, and the edges of the angled side get smaller and create layers as you're rolling, like our round or oblong beads. And that's what the cone-shaped bead will look like. Notice how it's thicker on one side than the other. To make our double cone, we're going to start by drawing a rectangle. So I'm going to make this rectangle 2 inches wide, and I'll mark 2 inches on the top and the bottom of my paper. Then I'll place my ruler between those two lines and draw a straight line between them, and now we have our rectangle. But we're not done, because we have to cut a triangle shape out of the middle like that. So to make this triangle cutout, I'm going to start by marking about 2 inches up from the bottom of my paper. So I'm going to draw a line here, and then I want to find the place on that line that's in the middle of my paper, or at 1 inch, and make a mark there. This mark will be one of the points of our triangle. So I'm lining my ruler up with that mark and then drawing up to meet one corner of my rectangle. Then I'm going from that mark to the other corner of my rectangle. And now I have this funny shape that I'm going to go ahead and cut out. Then begin rolling it up around your thin tube. And like the cone, remember to wrap the straight edges so they line up and the angled edges so they create layers. When you get to the triangles, my recommendation is to roll one triangle up first and glue that one in place. Then do the same with the other side. I would not recommend trying to roll both triangles up at the same time. It's just a little too tricky. So here I'm going to go ahead and glue down my first triangle. Then I'll finish wrapping and gluing my second triangle. And when you're all done, this double cone will be thicker on the outside and thinner in the middle. And of course, there are lots of other bead shapes that you could try. So have fun experimenting or check out some more examples at the link in the description. When you're all done making your beads, you can add them to some string to create your own jewelry. Now, I usually do this with plain beads, but if you'd like, you could glaze your beads to give them a shiny coating and to add some protection. Some popular glazes include clear nail polish, Mod Podge, clear finish spray, and polyacrylic finish. I'll include a link in the description with more information about these products and information on how to use them to glaze your paper beads. We hope you enjoyed learning how to make your own paper beads. If you do make some beads, we'd love to see them, so please take a picture and share it with us at the library. You can do so through our Facebook at www.facebook.com/FHCPL, through our Instagram. Our handle is @FHCPL, or you can send us an email. Our email address is makerspace@findlaylibrary.org. We hope to see you again soon for a new video. See you then. Bye!